Um, so, MA Creative Events Management, 720 Creative Practice in Event Design, interview with Scott A. Lukas. Hello, everyone. Today I'm talking with Scott A. Lukas. Scott is a cultural anthropologist based at Lake Tahoe Community College, where he's faculty chair of teaching and learning. He's the author and editor of A Reader in Themed Immersive Spaces and the Immersive World's Handbook, amongst many other texts. And he's also a renowned industry expert on designing themed spaces for entertainment, for example, theme parks, museums, retail locations. He's also been a theme park trainer and a consultant for Walt Disney Imagineering, Pixar, ABC, and as if that wasn't enough, he also has a keen interest in experimental music composition and performance, which I'm hoping we'll also talk about today. So in this interview, we're going to look at particularly approaches to immersive and themed experiences and how we might bring this to event design. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us about your work. And perhaps we could start by discussing your own background and how themed immersive experiences became such a significant area of work and research for you.
Sure. Thank you, Claire. And it's always great to talk with your students and your classes. I just enjoy the focus of your program that you're doing in terms of experience design. And so, I'll give a bit of my backstory. So I began when I was working on my PhD in cultural anthropology at Rice University, which is in Houston, Texas, in the United States. I had seen a job posting for a position at a theme park. The theme park was called Astroworld. This is a brochure from 1968, the year that it opened. And it's no longer open. It has since closed, sadly. But it was one of these situations where I saw this job posting and I thought that would be a unique experience. And then sort of accidentally that became the focus of my dissertation, because working at the theme park was just so fascinating just from a service industry perspective, and dealing with all the dynamics, day-to-day aspects of the operation, which I think for your students is always an interesting side of things. Sometimes in industry, talk about the design side, and then the practice side, of course, is the operation of running a theme park with all its challenges and so forth. And this was in the mid to late 90s, and of course we didn't have COVID then, and I know we'll be talking about some of the dynamics of COVID, but my dissertation then focused on my experiences training in this particular theme park, and I also did some tangential research where I went across the United States and brought in perspectives about other theme parks. And so when I first started studying this, it was really more about service industry culture. Certainly the dynamics of a theme park were important. But as I started to work on my first text, which was the edited collection of Theme Space, my focus started to shift more to issues of design and specifically focusing on the context of theming. And I think theming is one of those things we'll talk about later that is really a hallmark of the industry since Walt Disney pioneered it, as well as Angus Wynne, who was the founder of Six Flags theme park industry or corporation, the first one, which was in north of Dallas, Texas, Six Flags Over Texas. And so Astroworld, of course, was part of the Six Flags corporation. So as I started to develop this interest in theming, eventually that transformed into a focus on cultural remaking. So with a colleague, I did a book on film remakes, and I still have in the back of my mind a monograph on looking generally at this issue of remaking. And as we'll talk about later with theming, theming is a form of remaking a place where you transform your space by bringing in design elements and cues and archetypes of another space or another culture. Eventually, sort of these interests started to coalesce on the entirety of the theme park industry, and that led to the book Theme Park, which was published by the UK press Reaction. They do quite a few books in this series actually on key, I'm trying to hold it up in the camera there, key, if you will, objects. They could be spatial objects like a theme park, or they could be a motorcycle. And so it was a really fun challenge to think about the theme park industry sort of in this bigger sense that really drew on some of my earlier interests in theming. And that book actually eventually got translated into Arabic as well. So that was kind of interesting. So my evolution, I think, as a bit of a reminder for students and industry professionals. I think a lot of us in our careers, whether we're working in the industry or we're working in more in academics like me, you see these transformations and changes over time. And one of the things that I wanted to mention that I think is really important for all students out there and industry professionals is to keep really an extensive focus on research. And this is a shot of me working at Walt Disney at Epcot Center, which you may be familiar with, and always having in mind the goal of trying to better understand spaces that we're studying. I think, having that insight, being able to visit spaces around the world, much of this happened, of course, pre-COVID, is really important to gaining perspective. And this is a piece I did for the community of leisure architects and designers. A lot of the references I'll mention in here are through the really fine publication Attractions Management, and they also published Clad Book in 2017 and 2018. And it was fun for me to work on some of these projects with them because in this particular case, I was writing about research, which is traditionally an academic topic from cultural anthropology, but I was trying to really gear this at individuals in the amusement design industry to say, how can you learn from spaces and then take some of that knowledge that you learn, translate it to new spaces? And some of this, I have to say, is not, I think a lot of people think if you're doing research, it's incredibly profound and abstract, but it can be very simple. And I gave an example in the article here about making a trip to an IKEA store, a pretty mundane store, and just looking at the spatial design, writing down some notes in your notebook, taking what we call in anthropology head notes, which are reminders about aspects of what you might want to study in the future. And that actually led to some opportunities, and this is sort of the evolution, what led to the Immersive Worlds Handbook. And in this particular book, I really wanted to draw on my insights, having worked in a theme park, and also drawing on some of my connections in the industry. So the book has quite a few interviews. We'll talk about some of these later in our conversation with individuals who are real experts in the field. One of those is Gordon Grice, who's pictured here. And for Attractions Management some time ago, along with Joel Beckerman, who owns Man-Made Music, which is a company that does sonic branding, we collaborated on a session at IAAPA, which is the big industry conference that happens. There's IAAPA Europe and IAAPA Asia. This was the main conference in Orlando, Florida. And we did a workshop on sensory design, and we also wrote this article. So one of the things I want to encourage everyone out there is to think of opportunities to make connections. And in my case, I want to make connections between academics who study theme spaces and industry professionals like Gordon, who's an architect, and Joel Beckerman, who's a sound designer, and to really collaborate in ways where you can think, in this case, about sensory design in new respects, where you're really bringing in and offering opportunities to think from both academic and industry perspectives. And Gordon was a contributor. This is the last book I'll mention, to the latest reader. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but you can actually download this free of charge on the web, so I will be sure with this video to include the link for that. And what was exciting for me about this reader was to take opportunities to draw on industry expertise and combine that with academic expertise. Because in my years of studying these spaces, I've really discovered that there isn't often a lot of dialogue between these two groups. And sometimes the academics who study the spaces have a really narrow view of them. And then sometimes the industry insiders maybe don't want to bring in some of these critiques that are very important in terms of looking at sustainability or commodification and practices related to consumerism. And so I think it's just really important to have that insight. And then lastly, I will mention this. So for years, I've also been working on documenting themed and immersive spaces on my YouTube site. And so it's another way to really stress that if you have a camera, it could be as simple as your cell phone, take that with you when you visit a space. Really record your observations. And even if you don't post it on a public channel like I do, I think it's a great opportunity for you to learn. You can see some of the pictures here in the middle are from one of my trips to Singapore when I presented at a heritage conference. And Singapore for me was a absolutely life-changing experience because some of the designs that I experienced there, some of the spatial emphases and some of the approaches to theming and immersion were absolutely like nothing else I had ever seen in the States or throughout Europe. So again, visiting spaces, looking at those spaces in new ways, taking some documentation of those spaces and audio visual senses, I think is really important. So to kind of close this, I would say that I encourage everyone to think about your approaches to design, to studying these spaces in ways that you really acknowledge your own transformation as well as the transformation of the spaces. And I would say that pre-COVID, as we talk today, certainly COVID is requiring us to think about spatial design and operation in entirely new senses.
That's such a great introduction, and you've highlighted a number of issues that are so pertinent to what we do, on the MA. So, we're so aware of the disconnect between industry and academia, and are so hell bent on, breaking some of those barriers down. Actually, the majority of people that we get to come and talk to us on the MA are based in industry because of that. So, we always want that voice to be heard. And we want to work more, so we don't, my background is as a practicing event manager, so I don't come from I don't know if there is a traditional way into these things, but mine certainly isn't. So I don't recognize the distinction perhaps in the way that some others do, but it's great to hear that that there is a broader movement in trying to establish those links and getting everyone to work together, because what you collectively bring to the table is so much more exciting. It's that classic sum is greater than its parts, isn't
Absolutely.
it? So yes, we said we'll come back to talk about COVID at some point. But you've been so you've used the terms theming and immersion, and I just wondered if perhaps you could, for the uninitiated, your definition of what those things actually mean.
Absolutely. So I would call theming the use of any sort of predominant theme, and we'll talk about some of those, but an example would be a Western theme, an old Wild West theme, that is used to structure the design of a commercial or consumer space. And immersion, we could say, is the ability of a designer or an operator of a space to envelop a guest within that space, which I would say is very similar to the idea of the suspension of disbelief. I live with a poet and a writer, and we're often talking about this idea that if you're writing an evocative form of poetry, or certainly a novel, a piece of fiction, you want to bring that reader into that space. And of course, the same thing happens in theater. So I think sometimes here we're talking about three-dimensional space and design, but it really is important, I stress this throughout a lot of my work, to collaborate with others who are doing work in the theater. I know right now, we'll talk later about this, that this was pre-COVID, there's a really big movement. I've seen a lot of advertisements for immersive and evocative theater events in London, secret cinema and other events. And so I think theater design is a side that sometimes it is lost as well in terms of bringing in that emphasis from performance. And I should mention that in this latest volume, when I wrote the theme Space, which was the first one in 2007, and then this last reader's 2016, really, at this time, immersion wasn't getting used. And then over the almost 10 years, 9 to 10 years in which I wrote the first one and then this last one, we started to think of these two in tandem. So sometimes we were talking about theming, but of course we were really discussing the idea of immersion. So I really think of these two together. And I've included here 3 charts from the reader, again, which you can download. Check out that link, the reader and themed and immersive spaces. So it was important for me to really combine these emphases. And if you read the many chapters in this book, individuals, of course, are talking about traditional elements of theming, but they're also talking about immersion, which I think sometimes can be getting into spatial design, use of performance, sensory cues in a space that maybe don't rely on some of the traditional modes of theming or more explicit modes. So you might have more like what you see in Las Vegas today, where there's a movement away from theming and more to immersion in lifestyle designs, where you see rather abstract or non-representational designs that can be just as evocative and result in that suspension of disbelief that we talk about in fiction and theater, but that maybe don't rely on traditional forms of theming, perhaps in part because some of those design trends, particularly the Wild West, maybe seems a little bit dated and not very interesting to explore in terms of some of the approaches that designers are taking today. So this first table is simply saying that when you think about theming and immersion, you could think about different modes that it happens through. So of course we have architecture and material design and decor. We have narrative, that important text or backstory that really develops, if you will, the guest's experiences with those design elements. We have technology, which is key, and I think later we'll talk about augmented and virtual reality, so some of this is changing. We have performance, which I noted early on in much of the work in the 1990s, the academic work, people did not talk about performance in theme parks. So they really talked about design. They didn't really get into the last area here, the guest and the guest's role in the space. And I think nowadays there's more emphasis, particularly what I see happening in Germany. I've worked and taught in Germany, and many of the students coming out of universities there are really interested in looking at forms of performance. So you would talk about a space like a theme park or a historical reenactment space, and these are very big in Europe, I think much more than the States. And you would want to get into those issues of how people perform themes or perform a particular themes through actions and through their roles. And it's very important, of course, in communities of historical reenactment and what we call LARPs, live action role-playing communities. We can also say that theming and immersion take place in various locations, and we can look at a slew of these here, ranging from the theme park to virtual spaces. We'll talk probably later as we get into COVID. I'm really concerned actually about the cruise ship industry, because it's one of those spaces that I think we'll have to think about either design changes or operational changes, or both, because a lot of these spaces we'll talk about today were designed pre-COVID, as our university and college spaces are, and now we have to come to terms with the fact that we're changing along with the pandemic, and so some of these spaces necessarily will have to change. So we could see alterations, of course, in these types of spaces. We'll talk, I think, towards the end, particularly about home spaces and how maybe in a post-COVID world we'll see more immersion happening in our home spaces. And then lastly, the source materials of theming and immersion. Particularly with theming, you sometimes see a famous place is recreated, like the Paris, Las Vegas. And then you also might have, in today's day and age, brands are very significant in terms of developing theming. If you ever make it to Munich, Germany, I really recommend a visit to BMW World. It's one of the most amazing branded spaces I've ever visited. And that's a space that fully immerses you, but it doesn't really have traditional theming. The theming is more the brand itself of BMW and what it could mean to an individual in terms of their lifestyle. And I'll end on this slide because I think one of the things that's interesting about theming is that sometimes it's seen as controversial, because if you look at a place like Venice, when you visit a great city like Venice, the smells, the sights, the spaces, the actions, the context are all there for you as a whole. And then if you're remaking that for a new space in a new time, like the Venetian Las Vegas, you maybe take a handful of those multiplicities that you experience and you try to recreate those. And for academics, I think, more than designers, this is controversial because they feel like you are somehow, we'll get into this later in our focus talking about culture and nation, but academics feel like this is really taking and stereotyping and culturally appropriating another space. And I think it's an important conversation to have in our design schools to talk about. And we'll discuss this later with Tiki. I'm thinking ahead to some of my notes, but I'll tell you a great story about someone who read one of my pieces on Tiki and said his explicit goal was to use it in a way to make a non-racist Tiki bar, and a Tiki bar that was not guilty of cultural appropriation. So I see this as a continuing issue and challenge, I think, for the design world, is to think about this topic of how you might theme a space, but make it as much as possible not offensive to individuals who might live in that actual space that you're recreating for this new context. So I think that's for me an interesting challenge today, talking about theming immersion, is how to not be culturally insensitive when we're doing some of these designs.
And I think you're talking about it in those terms. We can talk about it from the people who currently live in those places, but obviously there is this whole kind of relationship that we have with the past and what that means. And the past which cannot speak for itself. And there's a lot of I speak so my background is a classical historian, so I have this sort of very tortured relationship with the past. In terms of how present it still is, certainly in sort of Western worlds, particularly within Europe. It's not simple, but it can be appeared. It can appear simple, but that's also, it runs the risk of reductionism and many negative claims, despite best intentions.
Absolutely. And I would just say one thing about that, because I mentioned earlier this Heritage Conference in Singapore, and I was really excited that the individuals there were thinking about heritage in new senses. Heritage does not have to mean really a sense of the past. It doesn't have to mean something simplified. And so I think whatever we're doing in our designs or our studies of heritage and history, to make that complexity of what we see in the diagram on the left side more present in our studies and in our designs, to me, that is incredibly exciting. Instead of looking for those really simple solutions, whether they're design solutions or if you're studying this, academics, I think, have certainly been guilty of oversimplifying some of the diversity that I see in themed and immersive spaces.
I think you're right. I think there are no innocent parties here.
Right. Exactly.
So you've talked about the sort of the evolution of how we're speaking about these things, and obviously kind of part of that is related to the evolution of our demand for these things and the appetite that audiences seem to have. And I think we have an increasing appetite for immersive spaces, for increasing complexity. We see through what maybe in 1950, 1960, 1970 we would have found joyful. I guess we can all think back to the theme parks of our childhoods and think how simple they were in comparison in terms of design. So I wondered, what do you think that there are a number of key drivers that are kind of making this demand for ever more complex and participatory designs? The audiences seem that they need to escape, and I wondered what you think is behind that.
Great question. I'll actually start with a space actually I think is not a very good example. And I talked about this in the Immersive Worlds Handbook, and this was a space, I believe near Bournemouth, called Lapland New Forest. And it made quite the news, a bit of news on BBC and The Guardian back in 2008. And the two organizers, creators of the space, I think actually served prison time and were fined $1 million for fraud, subsequent investigation. But I always look at, sort of began this discussion of looking at spaces maybe that missed the mark. And Lapland New Forest was promising guests opportunities to escape into a Christmas wonderland. And as you can see from these very sad pictures here, they had just really pathetic conditions of how animals were kept. And they had, I found quite interesting, this was their Christmas market. So they had a very simple space with some garland and a plug-in reindeer of some sort, if I can make that out. And I use this as an example because I think it really clearly is such an important task today to imagine the best possible spaces and the worst spaces. And if you're familiar with Banksy's Dismaland, which I think had mixed reactions from the press, but the image on the left is actually one of the elves from Lapland New Forest, and the image on the right is one of the workers from Dismaland. And I was looking at this last week, and I thought to myself, clearly Banksy must have seen this controversy that happened in 2008 and maybe incorporated some of that into Dismaland, because Dismaland, of course, was trying to bring in political critique and aesthetic critique. It was very heavily focused on art, installation art and visual arts, to really critique, I think, both the theme park industry and also to critique Western societies in terms of a lot of political issues that we should clearly be concerned about. So I use the example of Lapland New Forest to really emphasize that designers have to think about spaces in very careful senses. And I'm just trying, give me 1 second here to advance the slide. There we go. And so I'll tie this to the concept of authenticity. And clearly for a lot of the guests who visited Lapland New Forest, there probably weren't senses, and judging from, I didn't visit the space, but I read some of the interviews, and many of the people said they just could not suspend their disbelief. They found like it was a joke. They were upset at the fact that they paid good money to visit a space that promised one thing and delivered another. And so I've talked about this in terms of, in this article here, authenticity. And I think when we talk about authenticity and designing a space, we have to think about it in some very careful senses. I talk about authenticity could involve things like process. It could involve detail, of course, in terms of emphasizing your design elements and emphasizing details in terms of performance that happens in the space. And I also talk about revision, that spaces should change over time in ways that guests will be able to connect with them. And to contrast Lapland New Forest, I would offer this image here. This is from Disney's Animal Kingdom, a space that I think has a lot of incredible theming and immersion. And I have this particular image here of this wall because I think this is an example of how we might think about that, what Clare talked about here, that idea of complexity in terms of design. Disney, of course, when they design a space, they spend a huge amount of time thinking about all the nuances of that space. And then when they get into the production of those designs, they really get down to the fine details. The fact that you see wear and tear, the patina of sort of time. We talked about history before. You can see this in all the details on the wall. The sort of palimpsest of one poster on top of another, and those posters start to decay over time. You really have a sense of what one of my colleagues, the archaeologist Cornelius Holtorf, calls pastness. This idea that you're seeing something that appears as if it was there a while, even though, of course, it's a very, in terms of chronological time, it's a very new space. Now, the one warning or challenge, I guess I would say, in terms of thinking about authenticity and design, maybe for design students and folks in the industry, is what I have at the bottom here, this idea of authenticity on a budget. Obviously, the worst case scenario is someone designs a space that is so lackluster and it becomes almost offensive, like Lapland New Forest. But in the case of what Disney is doing, they're very rare. Not many companies, including when I worked for Six Flags, we did not have the ability to do design elements or approaches to design anywhere near what you see here on the screen in terms of Disney's Animal Kingdom. So I think one challenge in talking about authenticity when we put it in the context of themed spaces is we often use Disney as the exemplar. We have all those wonderful design books, the Imagineering Guide to all their theme parks, but then we never address in those books the fact that most people, whether you're designing for maybe a small space, a small museum, or you have an amusement park, but it's not on the scale of capital in terms of transmedia and IP or intellectual property of Disney. So I think one real challenge for all of us to think about is how can you do design, as they call it here, on a budget in such a way that you are able to be very cognizant of the fact that you don't have all the resources of say, Disney. Apologize, my next slide here is being a little slow. I'm just waiting for it to catch up. Let me try to advance it this way. So kind of going back to this theme of authenticity, we could talk about some keys to immersion that I've discussed here in this article on why immersion matters. And this is not just really addressing authenticity, but it's talking about the experience of the guest. And so the idea that we sometimes underestimate the guests' or visitors' experience or knowledge, I think is really key to designing a space that benefits from the participation of the guest in that space. And it's something that we often, I think, forget about when we're designing. I'm repeating some of this, but of course the importance of storytelling is key to designing a great and authentic space. Thinking about connectors and transitions, it's one of the things I would point to. Again, Disney, even though I'm acknowledging the budgetary limitations of maybe most people who don't work for a corporation like Disney. But if you look at some of the transition spaces in Disney's Animal Kingdom, you see that no space is left unturned. Even something as simple as a sign or a walkway, when you're going from one theme land to the next, they still continue to focus on the design. If the theme of one theme land is changing from one to the other, they have transitions between those spaces such that you don't feel like an abrupt change when you're going from one theme land to the next theme land. And again, Disney is top of the industry. They have the most capital available, but it's a great reminder when you look at some of these visual examples of how we might think about the significance of creating spaces that have that sense of authenticity and in this case, connectors and transitions. And then the willingness to change is also important. When we think about a space, we should clearly consider that space as itself evolving over time. And I'll end here on the idea of storytelling. And this is a recent find here where I discovered that it's an auto brand, nothing to do with the themed or immersive design industry. But they were talking about storytelling as, or a car rather, as a storytelling machine. And this term storytelling is probably the next one that will continue to gain traction, like theming and immersion, because storytelling, I think, offers an opportunity to more fully immerse guests in a particular space. And I was thinking of this maybe from the perspective of a bit of a design challenge. I was at the Postal Museum in London well over a year ago, and I don't know what people in the UK think of the Postal Museum. I thought it was pretty fascinating, but for me, what made it fascinating was they took a particularly what I think would be a dull topic. I don't think when you think of the postal system, although in the U.S. with our last president, fortunately our last president, Donald Trump, he's gone now, there was quite a bit of controversy related to voting in the postal system. But this is not a particularly, I think, a topic that strikes you as sexy or exciting, but yet I think through some evocative design, through some theming, and a ride where you get to ride on one of the postal carts of old that is no longer used, they do take a topic or a context that I think is maybe a bit dull, but they make it exciting and evocative because they're using design and they're using storytelling. So I thought of it maybe for your students, maybe do something like this already, but what about a design challenge where you give them a particularly dull topic and then you say you have to design an evocative space? Because I think in the States, unfortunately, a lot of times, we design museums around, the natural world or topics that are considered exciting, like dinosaurs or something like this. But if you took a very dull topic and you turn that into, through storytelling and design, an exciting space, I think that could be a very, very interesting, maybe, opportunity for a design challenge. I don't know if you've ever done anything like that in your program or not.
Well, we do, but there's always space for more. So I'm just thinking about that one. Just thinking of the dullest topic that I can possibly think of. I think it's a really good point about budgets and sort of dull topics. But I think what's lovely about looking at examples like Disney and looking at, you mentioned BMW World, very often we look at those big companies with the big budgets. We can take from them, can't we? And then just in our own kind of ways, in accordance to our own budgets, we can lift some of that that luxury that they've had with time and space and et cetera, and add some of that to what we're doing. I think there's always the option
Absolutely.
to be clever with this. And I don't mean, I mean clever in its loveliest sense, those little hints through font, through paper use, or there's just these little touches that you can bring in. And as you say, those kind of transitional spaces. So what can you do to make the journey to the bathroom, at least in some way part of the the rest of the experience? And I think there are always ways, and that's, for me, that's part of the fun of this whole industry, is recognizing those things as challenges and seeing how you can bring your creativity to it.
Absolutely.
I wanted to ask, sort of in relation to that. So we're talking about this as if everyone's going to kind of accept and understand our intention of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But so Derek Foster in one of the essays in the Reader text notes theme space as a site of symbolic action, an environment filled with texts to be read and textures to be felt. But I think there's a number of things that evokes for me, which is that we have an intended meaning, but we also have potential other meanings that audiences might take. And it comes back to that point that you made initially about spaces potentially being offensive to people. So I wondered, I'm sensing that you think it's quite important for event designers to be proficient in their understanding of the multiple levels of meaning that we can have and we can take from spaces.
Absolutely, really important. And it goes back to earlier I talked about this idea of bringing anthropology into the study of these spaces. And particularly in anthropology, we talk about something called the insider's view of culture. And so it's the idea that if you visit another culture, the way that they would see that culture, having grown up in it, speaking the language, eating the food, participating in the folkways and customs, as an anthropologist, it's a real challenge to go in and try to understand that culture from that insider's perspective. So what Derek is getting at, I think, really reminds me of a couple of things. One, it reminds me of the need to do sufficient research so that if you're designing a space, you think about, as you mentioned earlier, ways that certain meanings in that space might be offensive, and we'll talk about this in relationship to tiki culture later. I think it's also what Derek was getting at in his piece. He was studying spaces around the world that are specifically geared at fans and fandom. And I have to say, this is one of those areas that when I wrote the theme space and some of the earlier texts, we weren't talking about 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now there are entire books that are being written just on fandom related to theme park studies. And so an example of that right here is the wonderful world of Harry Potter. And I know J.K. Rowling has been in the news maybe for her comments about the transgender community and so forth. So there's been some controversy there. But everyone is very familiar with the Harry Potter franchise, and it's one of the most successful, maybe the most successful. I don't know in terms of total dollars if it's bigger than Star Wars, but it's certainly in the top 5. And so the fact that you had this franchise that had global fame, global interests. This is a shot from the Wizarding World of Harry Potter at Universal. And I have to say, when I visited this space, I was really amazed. You talked about earlier, even the bathrooms were themed and were part of this magical world of Harry Potter. And the Harry Potter world reminds us of transmedia. And if you're not familiar with transmedia is the idea that we're telling stories now through multiple venues. So if you write the books, the Harry Potter books, you have then the films, you have all sorts of merchandise that is brought in, from games to the wands that you can buy at the theme park. And then, of course, you have the theme park spaces. And the big folks in the industry, from Universal to Disney and others, when they're doing design, and I've experienced some of this firsthand in some of my training experiences, can't talk about them, but I can say that they have a vision that is very much focused on transmedia and IP. And IP refers to intellectual property. And I find that for some of the theme parks, most recently, some of the theme parks I visited in Germany, that they struggle in some cases because transmedia and IP, in terms of the storytelling, what Derek was getting at in his piece was people have experiences with Game of Thrones, or they have experiences with Harry Potter, and then they want to experience those stories or movies or films or shows in their three-dimensional senses. So in telling these stories today, I think as designers, you have to be aware of the fact that many of the stories to be told are transmedia stories. And on the one hand, it presents opportunities because you know the story you're telling is, in this case, the story of Harry Potter. But then, going back to that diagram of the Venetian, you still then have to distill and take maybe moments from the Harry Potter books or films and decide that that'll be an experience. You can't do every single experience in the universe, the multiverse, whatever you call it, of Harry Potter. So I think Derek's piece really reminds me of that opportunity to think about telling stories in transmedia senses. And maybe even for some of your students doing designs, maybe some of them will be doing three-dimensional designs, but then maybe others will be interested in developing virtual reality, augmented reality, or app-based experiences as well. The second thing I would mention here is just when we're thinking about the guest experience and telling stories, we have to, again, go back to my earlier point, really think about the fact that it's not necessarily our experience that we should be concerned about, but whatever the guest's experiences might be. And in the Immersive Worlds Handbook, one of my interviewees, Gordon Jones, he's a historian and Civil War reenactor, he offered this quote when I asked him about authenticity, and I specifically focused in this interview on how do you understand authenticity in the world of reenactment. And we had a really engaging discussion, but this quote here on the left is really what I want to focus on, because what Gordon said is, when you're thinking about authenticity in terms of the reenactment community, what he said here is, when you talk about being effective at stimulating a rush, historically themed environments need not be true in a historical sense. They need only be real, in quotes, in the eye of most beholders. As seen in reenacting, though, what is real is always contested, since each of us imagines and approaches the past differently. And what Gordon discovered in his work in reenactment communities is that not everybody will view a particular battle or a particular space of the Civil War in the same way. So how do you then go about reenacting a space or a battle or an event in a way that people will see it from their own perspectives as authentic? And I think that's one of the great challenges today, and I've certainly experienced that in visiting, say, the space of Harry Potter in Orlando, Florida, where, you know, a visitor from the UK might experience it a different way than a visitor from the States. And particularly if you get into someone who's a true fan and they know everything about Potter, or they know everything about Star Wars, in terms of some of the Star Wars theme park experiences that are being developed today. And how do you design for both groups? And what Gordon talks about is that within the reenactment communities, you have people he calls hardcore people who they live and breathe the Civil War. They know everything about it. They want to experience it in the most authentic sense, sleeping in mud, not having any modern conveniences. And then you have people somewhere in the middle who are not that hardcore. And then you have people that are called farbs. And these are people that are really looked down upon in the reenactment community because they bring their cell phones to the reenactments. And thus, in Gordon's mind, you could never get into the consciousness, if you will, to go back to folks like Collingwood and others who talk about sort of actually living the consciousness of someone from that time, almost doing time travel. You can't do time travel, it would seem to me, if you have a cell phone. So I think we can use some of these examples to think about doing designs in today's day and age in a way that takes into account the guest experience, but also the wide range of guest experiences. Because when someone comes to a space that you're designing, each person is coming with different cultural baggage and different knowledge about the space that you're designing, whether you're in a IP space, a transmedia space, or you're designing something from scratch. So I think it's another one of these great challenges that we're talking about from a design perspective is how do you address what Gordon is getting at here, that wide range of experiences that are brought by guests and visitors to the spaces that we are designing and talking about today.
It is, yeah. It is another challenge. So that sort of neatly leads us to my next question, which is around this, the idea of theming as a reflection of a nation. So could we talk a little bit more about this? So in event studies, we often talk about an event offer of a particular nation being part of its soft power. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you think this can be applied to themed entertainment spaces as well.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things to talk about, some time back, you can read this one free as well. It's the same press that did the reader I just wrote, a volume called "Meet Me at the Fair: A World's Fair Reader." And for that that book, I wrote this chapter on looking at the world exposition tradition and how it influenced theme parks. And I talk about 4 different areas: architecture and space, cultural displays, actually 5 areas: social patterns, consumption, commodity, rides, and attractions. And one of the things that you probably know studying world expositions is that the very early forms, and this is a shot from the exposition I always talk about. I just did an interview some time back on the Ferris wheel, and the Ferris wheel had its first real public display at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. And the World's Expo used to be really about the power of the nation, the great technology, the idea of cultural superiority. Unfortunately, a lot of times human zoos were parts of these early expositions. And I also talk about in some of my work about this idea that World Expos were really offering the idea of samples of cultures. So you would go to the Midway Plaisance at the World's Columbian Exposition or many of the expos to follow, and you would experience cultures from around the world. So you would have an iconic village recreated from the Philippines, or you would have a space from Ireland recreated. And so you're almost taking these bits and pieces of culture and you were sampling them. And as I say here, you were creating a narrative about those spaces. I use this term narrativization to suggest that you often take these key symbols and then you tell stories around them. And unfortunately, one of the key stories told through the early World Expos was the idea of cultural superiority. Our nation is superior, whether it was Europe or the United States, and you would present through the forms of these human zoos the savages of the world in these very ethnocentric tableaus of other cultures. We also see this, I think, in more contemporary spaces. You could look at 2 spaces that deal with war. This is from the Smithsonian exhibit, The Price of Freedom, Americans at War, back around, my visit was in the mid-2000s. And it was one that used the context of war to really talk about American superiority. This was after 9/11, so much of the narrative was starting with the past, and as you got into the present, it was justifying invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is from the Imperial War Museum back when I taught in London in 2004. And I always find that when museums in Europe, not to generalize, but World War II was a war that was directly felt in Asia, directly in Europe. In the U.S., of course, there was a war effort, but there weren't direct, with 1 or 2 exceptions, direct attacks on the continental U.S. So I think the fact that when you go to European museums like the Imperial War Museum, and there's much more a sobering focus on death and destruction, compare that to the U.S. version where it was justification of warfare and invasion. It's, I think, a really great reminder that when we're designing spaces, we have to be very aware that there are political contexts that are brought into these spaces, particularly if it's a theme like war that has a lot of heated emotions connected to it. I mentioned earlier the issue of tiki, and tiki is an example where I think it's an example of power being displayed, and very specifically the power of people to reappropriate, in this case, Polynesian and Hawaiian cultures. And so I wrote this article some time back on the cultures of tiki, and I was talking about doing some research visits to tiki conferences in the United States, where aficionados, again, we talked earlier about fan culture and how it relates to theme spaces, were showing their designs. It was very much a conference. It was called the International Tiki Marketplace and Conference. It was very much showcasing art and tiki art. It was also showcasing a bit of the fandom culture that you see at conferences like Comic-Con, with people selling records and memorabilia, tiki designs. And it was also individuals offering services where you wouldn't have to hire Clare, one of your students, to design, the tiki bar. You could actually buy pre-made tiki design elements. And so when I wrote this article, I thought to myself, hopefully people might read it and appreciate it in a way where they would think about the power, that soft power that you talked about, that comes with powerful nations and people from powerful nations being able to design and appropriate other cultures. And the interesting thing about this was the San Francisco MoMA did a short article about this, arguing for the abolishment of the tiki bar, and they actually referenced my piece. And then I discovered that someone had read my piece, and I redacted their name, but it's someone who's opening a fairly big tiki bar on the East Coast, I've since discovered. And this is kind of interesting. They said, I'm opening a new tiki bar with tiki-style drinks, and I don't want it to be appropriative or racist. I'm hoping this paper helps. Thanks for writing it. So it's my hope, I guess, that when people think about doing designs, they think about the inherent power of nations, and they think about the fact that hopefully the designs can be created in such a way that they're not focused on cultural appropriation. And I would argue that you could look to popular culture outside of the themed and immersive spaces industry. I would look at shows like Watchmen and Lovecraft Country that both dealt with the 1921 Tulsa race massacre, and they dealt with it in different ways. And it's interesting that for many people in the States, they were unaware of this incredibly racist part of American history, and it took popular culture to bring this to their attention. And I mentioned Lovecraft Country and Watchmen because they're television shows that deal with history and the past and racial history in some ways I think that could really inspire designs in the themed and immersive worlds. And to go back to the 1893 Expo, the good news on this, and I'm giving some good news because much of the past in terms of these design worlds is very sad, and it's very I think hurtful to look back at human zoos in the World Exposition. But we can feel maybe a little bit better that the latest expo from 2015, which I had a chance to visit and do some extensive studies at, was in Milan. And the two pavilions I show here, this is Pavilion 0, and this was a pavilion focused on, in this case, despeciation, the effect of our consumer lifestyle on our ecosystems. They had these incredible displays of garbage, and so you walk through these artistic recreations of garbage. And so they're really asking people to focus on issues of waste. And then they had images like this. It was actually a video board of the stock market. And they were talking about, in addition to the traditional things you'd see on the NASDAQ board, they talk about, new rules are needed for global agriculture. And then the second example was the Swiss Pavilion. And the Swiss Pavilion specifically designed everything around 4 food commodities. And I actually have examples of them. One was salt. Another one was apple. And these are all core food items in Swiss culture. And then there was albeit a plastic cup, a cup of water. And then the last one was coffee. And the whole idea of the space was, over time, you see these boxes. Each of these boxes contain one of those 4 key food elements. Over time, they started to run out of those elements. And they, in addition to having the physical space, they had an actual virtual space where the amount of the items, the water that was left, the apple that was left, the coffee, and the salt, also began to decrease. And the whole point of this space was to get the guest to say, you realize that if you take one of these items with you, someone else out there, maybe who needs it more than you, who needs the salt or who needs the fresh water, is unable to use that item or to have access to that item. So for me, the good news about this is that the spaces of the present in terms of the expo, and the most recent one, which was to have taken place in Dubai, was canceled in 2020 due to COVID. But I'm very optimistic that the expos to come, as compared to those displays of power back in the early 1900s and so forth, that they're more aware of some of these challenges. And so the political context that we see at the most recent examples of the expos, I think are definitely giving me some opportunities for optimism, because we need to be aware of, as you said, Claire, the dimensions of power, the issues of cultural appropriation, and then ending on this here with the 2015 examples from Milan, we really need to focus most of our design, I would say, on issues of sustainability, on issues of welfare, of reaching out to others and really trying to promote activism among our guests that visit these spaces. If someone visits a space like this, hopefully they will return home and say, I'm going to get involved in some campaign with Oxfam or some important NGO out there who's trying to make a difference in the world. So this is my hope with the issue of politics and power, is that now we're at a point where we can turn the corner and we can really encourage guests to take an active role in their communities and their own political interests, and hopefully not just come to these spaces thinking only as consumers might think. So maybe I'm naive in thinking this, but I really hope that this is the future of these spaces. I'm not sure what you think of this idea, but
well, I think much of what we teach is around ideas of social design and participatory design and human-centered design. So the human-centered design one I kind of want to replace by a kind of more holistic sort of planet-based design, if that makes sense. But this is entirely what we aim for and are hopeful for, and maybe we're naive, but I think we certainly feel that we have a responsibility if we are in a position where we are enabled, where we have people coming to our spaces, and we can, through amazing design, encourage thought and different action and so on and so on, and that are going to contribute to those massive global challenges. And I think that's something we all have to do. Yes, they can also be incredibly beautiful, entertaining, light-hearted, escapist, all of those other things that I think we also need and want out of experiences, but they can do so much more. I think that's what we're realizing. We can do so much more. I'm partly conscious of time.
Sure.
So I was going to ask you so the thing that about this particular the slide that we have here is that to me there's a kind of element of gamification that's been brought into play. So there's a participatory nature to it, and I think we see the introduction of AR and VR and as well as these kind of more physical game-based sort of tools. So, and I guess that also makes me think about the fact that we've been sort of driven online, where we're much more used to kind of gamification through gaming. I'm not a gamer, I have to say, but I'm very aware of the size of the world, and the number of people that are. So do you think it's possible for people to have immersive experiences, not in game-based, places, but in digital spaces, in digital contexts, that perhaps have these kind of gamified elements? Do you think we can have these kind of viable digital alternatives?
I think it's definitely possible. And the story about this was I was researching for our discussion. I was going to use this example of the Void, which was a space I visited in Las Vegas, and I was excited to include this. And I discovered that in part due to COVID and in part due to intellectual property battles with Disney, which I guess they were using Star Wars maybe without permission, they are no longer in business. And I use this example of the Void because it's an experience that combines traditional physicality of themed and immersive spaces with VR glasses. So you're actually moving in an actual physical space the whole time. What you're seeing on your glasses and hearing is this virtual experience of, in this case, it was a Star Wars game. And you would sit down, you would feel walls, and it was for me incredibly immersive and amazing. So the first part of this would be to say that I think although this article is saying, pre-COVID, this seemed like the future. Now the concern is, as you can see from this picture, these are very much enclosed spaces and they wouldn't be safe necessarily under COVID. But what I would say is that you could use some of these examples of these types of spaces. And the two spaces I would point everyone to is Kind Heaven, which is a space that still hasn't opened in Vegas, but one that has, is called Area 15. And Area 15 is using elements of traditional theme parks and lifestyle stores, but it's combining with theatrical experiences, it's combining with video games and more immersive experiences. And to jump to the idea of video games, I would say that if you look at new spaces that are in development as we speak, including the Disney Galactic Star Cruiser, these will bring in elements of gaming. So you'll have your mobile device. The storytelling will not just happen in the physical space. It will happen in the spaces of augmented reality if you're wearing glasses. It will happen through your cell phone. And even now when you visit theme parks, there's storytelling that's going on as well as data tracking through your cell phones, through GPS, and through opportunities of using mobile media. Jumping to the spaces of home spaces, I would say it's really interesting to think about, have some slides here, of whether or not some of these technologies that have emerged in the themed and immersive spaces industry, like virtual walls on cruise ships, will those come to impact us in our homes? And as we're talking now, my wife and I just recently purchased one of these Nordic Track bikes because, like a lot of people, we're trapped inside due to COVID. And one of the things I find fascinating about this is you have these video programs and your trainer is, you're riding your bike and you're experiencing the physicality of it. Your trainer is talking to you. And as you go up a hill, the device is telling itself to change your incline, so your bike does this, or there's more tension on your wheel so that it's harder to pedal up a hill and so forth. And I was telling my wife, I said, this maybe really is the future. Obviously, it's dependent upon technology. We have to have these screens or devices, but this is one opportunity maybe to extend some of those technologies of gaming and of theme park design into our home spaces. Now, the caveat is we would have to have, you could do certainly some of the things that you see in fictional worlds of, say, Star Trek and the holodeck. You could do this in a home space, but you would need all the technology, and that technology can be very prohibitive and expensive. So I guess for me, it's a question mark. It's a bit speculative. I think we'll see more examples of this coming into maybe the world of home fitness. But to what extent, I would question, do people want to do an escape room that's all virtual? Wouldn't you rather experience an escape room in an actual physical space than on your computer screen? And I think many of us in education are growing tired of these Zoom calls because we want to be back in a traditional physical classroom. So I think for me, it's a question to what extent these will impact, say, both the traditional public spaces in terms of augmented and virtual reality, if the void's closure is an example of maybe challenges during COVID, and then to what extent will these technologies become part of our home spaces? Will we be willing to pay for it, and will we enjoy the experiences? Or in the case of this guy, would you rather be out, maybe not riding your bike in the snow and ice, but maybe there would be more of an interest to do this actually out in nature than to experience it in a virtual sense?
I do wonder, if we were perhaps having this conversation 13 months ago, that's what I'm going to say, so before the world changed slightly, whether we would still be talking about the kind of the inevitable wholesale adoption of, VR and AR and, the ability of it, because it feels that we actually have just had it. We've experienced now what it is to not to have the choice, to not to be able to participate collectively together, to not have that kind of visceral experience. And I think whilst in some levels it feels like it's accelerated demand, I also wonder if people now understand what the difference is, right, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And maybe things are going to become more selective, as you say. Maybe it's in kind of this sort of home gyms, that kind of thing. But again, it does come back to, as you said, that idea of affordability. And I think that's, be it virtual reality, certainly we've been talking about that in the events industry for so long, and everyone's been kind of waiting for it to take off. But again, it comes down to cost and shared experience, and those two issues have yet to go away.
Right. So. And I would say, just real quick on that, in the world of COVID, the advantage of something like the Void, and again, its closure would contradict what I'm going to say, but the advantage is you're less reliant on the hardware and you're using more of the software. So with this example of the Nordic Trek bike, you can change up the software experiences, and you can experience a new world, as opposed to having to tear down that physical space like a theme park ride or attraction and build a new one or to retheme it. Now, again, maybe people don't want just the software experience, the virtual reality experience, in which case you still have to do the hard design and design for the physical spaces and maybe bring in some limited elements of augmented reality or virtual reality. So for me, it's an interesting question of what these spaces will look like in the future.
I think, if we also think about the fact that for many people, some spaces weren't accessible due to cost or, for many, many reasons. And that is something else that has changed. I think, we've been able to attend events that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to attend, albeit in a virtual space. So I think, there's something, I guess it's about keep retaining the leaps forward that we've made for those groups, perhaps those that have been traditionally excluded from environments, and seeing what we can take forward. So I have my final question for you, Scott. Do you have a piece of advice for students who are listening to this conversation and who would like to learn more about theming and immersion, or would like to kind of increase their understanding or their practice? Is there something that you'd suggest that they do?
Sure. Actually, let me give you two or three of these. One of these actually was from another experienced design program here in the States. This is some spaces of the experienced design program at the University of Indianapolis in Indiana, again in the United States. And I had a chance to visit and tour the program some time back. And what I found was really interesting was that they had a way of combining sort of the academic side of looking at designing spaces. So they took classes also from a historian. So I think it's very popular that historians are often teaching in these programs. So good on historians for having that ability to do both, to really bridge both worlds. But they took their classes in historical aspects of designing for these spaces. And then they actually had shops. So they got their hands dirty, so to speak. They had saws and they had fabrication shops, and they, they worked on games, and they created these spaces, again, in ways hopefully to not be culturally reductionistic and to be stereotyping and so forth. So one of my, I guess, charges for design students is to simply think about ways of expanding on your approaches to design, your craft, whether that is a physical craft or designing for technology through augmented reality or apps, and then also being able to balance, I guess, that in this case, historical, cultural information that informs your design, and then to think about that critically as you start to translate that into actual design processes, in this case with physical elements. And going along with that, I would also say to really think about this issue of adaptation. So as we're talking about COVID and as we're talking about adapting spaces for this new world, whether it's the cruise ship industry or the theme park industry, to really think about how from the beginning you think about adaptation, how you think about you're going to adapt to this new world. If COVID-19 is not the last pandemic, how will that change your approach to design? Will you have to think about more virtual elements? Will you have to think about social distancing and other protocols of public health, of a public health nature, as part of your design spaces? And then lastly, I would say to again really draw on what I talked about earlier, research and doing forms of research to make your designs more effective in a traditional sense, in terms of the design will be seen as the design of your space will be seen as popular and entertaining, but then also it will be seen as appropriate and not offensive to people visiting that space. So to really draw on research skills when you're thinking about whatever space you're designing in the future. But the reality of COVID, I think, unfortunately, right, it's for me the number one right now, and it's the one that I'm the most speculative about, because as I look at this image of the cruise ship Royal Caribbean, one of the Royal Caribbean cruise ships, I really wonder, is it possible to relaunch the cruise ship industry post-COVID? The only way I see it happening is probably when the vaccines completely knock the virus out and eliminate it. Otherwise, the cruise ship is a space that's designed with close spaces and large spaces of intense social contact. So I guess I close on a speculative element here of what this will look like in terms of not just the cruise ship industry, but any of these spaces that had a much different look, approach, and feel prior to COVID-19 hitting us.
I guess we can in addition to the designing the most boring space, think about how we can do that too. And I think that
Right.
is the challenge for students now, is to think about what that's going to look like.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Scott.
Thank you so much.
It's
Been a
been
pleasure.
fascinating to talk to you. I really, really appreciate your time and your insight. And yes, we'll include all the links to all your texts, which are brilliantly available. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure talking to you and all your students.
Thank you.
Great.